I'm Pete Peterson, a very grateful Dean of Pepperdine's Graduate School of Public Policy, and it's my delight to welcome you here to the School of Public Policy for today's event, Free Speech 2022. Before we get started, it's important to acknowledge those that make events like this possible, those that support our unique approach to public policy education and the preparation of public leaders. One of the last times I was in this room was for another event that they funded and supported, and so it's my delight again to welcome back to Pepperdine those who have made this event possible. Howard Amundsen, along with his son David here from Fieldstead Company. I've said before, and I'll just say it again, we are the very fortunate recipients of support from a variety of friends and foundations. One of the things that's been so great about working with Howard and David in this particular event, but also the others we've done together, is that it's a chance to talk through things. It's not just a matter of saying, we'd like to do an event on X, make it happen. You get an opportunity to work with both of them and their great team who are here today to put together an event like this that brings together really such a unique mix of thinkers, policymakers, activists, and scholars. This is an auspicious event in what is an auspicious year for the School of Public Policy. As you see in the screen behind me, this is our 25th anniversary year for the School of Public Policy. And as part of that effort, we have selected as our theme for the anniversary year a passage that comes from Pepperdine University's Affirmation Statement. The Affirmation Statement is a series of declarations that the university, its employees, staff, and faculty affirm in being a part of this community. One of those statements is the subject and theme for our anniversary year, and it goes thusly: that freedom, whether spiritual, intellectual, or economic, is indivisible. Now, I think in each one of those categories, whether we talk about spiritual freedom, religious freedom, intellectual freedom, certainly in college campuses around the country, or economic freedom, each of these freedoms are under attack. And that's why it's important that when we came to select our own theme for this anniversary year, that we declared what we are about. Now, it may sound strange that a graduate school of public policy would care about something like freedom. I mean, these places are generally pretty boring technocratic institutions. They care deeply about cost-benefit analysis and multiple regressions and understanding by various Excel spreadsheets and stated programs why policy A is better than policy B. And we do care about those things. We do teach those things. This is a Master of Public Policy degree program that we offer here. But we care about something more. What those things are is the how of public policy. What freedom is the why of public policy. Freedom is the why of the School of Public Policy, and it has been always thus. From our founding by the late, great social scientist, Dr. James Q. Wilson, through leaders like Jack Kemp who have taught here, a variety of scholars and academics have been a part of this school's mission. And it's important that we declare what that mission is. And it's important that we say that a school like this one that is about preparing public leaders and policymakers understands what the goal is. The goal is freedom. And so everything that we do this year is aligned somehow with that mission statement. And of course, today's conference, Free Speech 2022, is about exploring not just the challenges to freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry, but also to look at the opportunities. So I want to make a couple things very clear as you experience not only this keynote, but the panels that will follow. First and foremost, this is not intended to be a dour, depressing conversation just looking only at the challenges to free speech. As a Christian university and as a Christian myself, I'm a person of hope. But we need to take seriously what the challenges are, and we are going to be exploring them not only in this first keynote, with no one better than Dr. Robby George to tell us and speak to us about the challenges today, but also the opportunities. And so in each of the panels, we're going to be looking at the opportunities, and certainly as we conclude with my conversation with Brian Barton, looking at even new institutions that are coming online to defend and understand and promote freedom of speech in our major institutions. Second thing I want to make clear, this is not a partisan issue. As you'll hear from the various panelists, some of whom I know what their political affiliations or leanings might be, some I have no idea, this has gone beyond a simple partisan issue. Whether we're talking about free speech in the big tech world, whether we're talking about free speech on college campuses, whether we're talking about free speech in journalistic media, academia, one of the really exciting things that's been happening over the last few years has been the coming together of people that are there from across the political spectrum to defend these founding principles that are essential to the health and flourishing of our communities and these particular institutions. It's one thing that we've always understood at the School of Public Policy, that we will always have friends across the political divide when it comes to standing for America's founding principles. Nothing else matters. Nothing else matters. So as we look at your brochures, as we look at the agenda for today, all been put together here, I just wanted to draw your attention. We will begin with the keynote from Dr. George, and then we will move to the Wilburn Auditorium, where we will begin our series of panels, beginning with a look at the media, then the internet or big tech, then looking at academia, and then concluding with a conversation I'll be having with Brian Barton. I hope you can stay. I know others are coming and going throughout the afternoon. We do have a great reception planned at Spruso's, which is just down Coast Highway from here. Let me just also say, I really apologize for the weather. You know, of all the things that we had planned for this event, I thought the weather was the one thing I could count on. I just want to let you know, especially for our out-of-town visitors, we are working on that, and we are looking for the sun to come out at some point this afternoon. So without any further ado, let's get into our conference today. In many ways, we built this conference around the keynote, and I couldn't be more happy to welcome Robby George back to Pepperdine. As many of you know, he is one of our most articulate defenders of America's founding principles, a man of great courage, who has spoken and defended these principles in a variety of settings that were not the most friendly to him, and in some cases are not the most friendly to him. And maybe we'll talk a little bit about that today. He is the McCormick Professor of Jurisprudence and the director of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University, which, as I understand it, is a very good school in New Jersey. He also happens to be our Ronald Reagan Honorary Distinguished Visiting Professor here at the School of Public Policy. And so without any further ado, please join me in welcoming our keynoter, Dr. Robby George.
Pete, it's really an honor to be here, and to be here for the first time as the Ronald Reagan Honorary Professor. It's also my first time on campus as the Newt Barr Honorary Professor in the School of Law, so I'm very honored by that as well. And I want to congratulate you and Jim and Paul Karen and everyone at Pepperdine who's working so hard to make this university a truly great and faithfully Christian university. We need such institutions in this country. We need them rather desperately. And I applaud your efforts, and I want to do everything that I can to support them. I want to thank the Amundsons. Howard and Roberta are old friends of mine, and I enormously admire the way they have used the wealth with which they've been blessed to advance the cause of knowledge, learning about the true and the good and the beautiful. Time and time again, when something important and valuable is happening on the intellectual side of things, it's Roberta and Howard and their family sponsoring it. So thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to get together with some old friends, Naomi and Tunku and Brad and Gail and others. I don't get to see them often enough. And to meet, at least in person for the first time, some new friends like Bayan and Kimi. It's great to have the opportunity to see you not on a Zoom screen, but in person, and I hope this will be the first of many. My theme for today is self-mastery, academic freedom, and the liberal arts. When those in the vanguard, or many of those in the vanguard of the countercultural movement of the 1960s, became professors and college and university administrators, they did not overthrow the idea, or at least an idea, of liberal arts education, liberal arts learning. In a great many cases, they proclaimed themselves to be true partisans of liberal arts ideals. Now, it's true that many representatives of that generation, now in positions of influence and authority in the academy, believe that universities should be in the forefront of producing young men and women who will be social activists. More than a few seem to be eager to transform university education into a species of vocational training for aspiring ACLU lawyers or Planned Parenthood volunteers or Black Lives Matter activists or community organizers. There are indeed, or so I am told, some colleges and universities that actually offer academic credit for social activism, so long as it is on the right, that is to say, the left side. Others, however, resist the idea that learning should be instrumentalized in this way. They don't think that universities should be fundamentally about producing investment bankers for Goldman Sachs or social justice advocates. They profess allegiance to the traditional, or in any event, traditional sounding idea that the point of liberal education is to enrich and even liberate the student learner. That's what's supposed to be liberal about liberal arts learning. It's supposed to convey knowledge and impart the intellectual skills and habits of mind that carry with them a certain profound form of freedom. Now, however traditional this may sound, there's nevertheless an unbridgeable chasm between the idea of liberal arts education as classically conceived and the conception sponsored and promoted by some, though not all, in positions of influence in academic institutions today. Many academic humanists and social scientists working in contemporary higher education propose as the goals of liberal learning liberation. But the question is, liberation from what? In their conception, what I will call the revisionist conception and then contrast with the classical conception, it's liberation from traditional social constraints and norms of morality, the beliefs, principles, and structures by which earlier generations of Americans and people in the West generally had been taught to govern their conduct for the sake of the common good and personal virtue. Now, why do they regard this form of liberation as desirable? Because it has become a matter of dogma that many of the traditional norms and structures are irrational, or worse, that they are vestiges of superstition and phobia that impede people's embracing their true identities and the free development of their personalities by restricting their capacities to act on their desires. In this dogmatic context, the purpose of liberal arts learning is to undermine whatever is left of the old norms and structures. To accomplish this task, teaching and scholarship are meant either to, one, expose the texts and traditions once regarded as the intellectual treasures of our civilization, the Bible, Plato, Augustine, Dante, Chaucer, Aquinas, Shakespeare, Austen, Locke, Gibbon, the authors of the Federalist, and so forth, as mere works of propaganda meant to reinforce unjust, say racist, sexist, homophobic, etc., social structures, social orders. Or, from my point of view, still more insidiously, two, to show how the old texts and traditions can be reappropriated and used as tools to subvert allegedly unjust, racist, sexist, etc., contemporary social orders. And beyond this, liberal arts learning is meant to enable students to become truly authentic individuals, people who are true to themselves. Here the question is, what is the self to which the authentic person is true? For partisans of liberationist and identitarian ideology, to be true to oneself is to act on one's feelings and desires, to affirm them, whatever they are, embrace them, act on them. Indeed, what one fundamentally is on this account is one's feelings and desires. So authenticity, that is being true to oneself, is understood to consist in doing what you really want to do, being who you feel you really are, in defiance, if necessary, of expectations based on putatively outmoded moral ideas and social forms. Now, according to this conception of personal authenticity, whatever impedes one from doing what one truly wants to do, unless that is what one happens to want to do is in violation of some norm of the governing ideology, is a mere hang-up, something that holds one back from being one's true self, from being the person one truly is. Such impediments, be they religious convictions, moral ideals, or what have you, are to be transcended for the sake of the free and full development of one's personality or identity. The very essence of liberation, as reconceived by partisans of the revisionist conception of liberal arts education, is transcending such hang-ups. I submit to you that nowhere is this clearer than in freshman orientation programs in many colleges and universities throughout the United States, including my own, my one in Princeton, not my one at Pepperdine, that feature compulsory events, the freshmen are a captive audience, designed to undermine any lingering allegiance to traditional norms of morality or decency that the new students may happen to bring along from their benighted homes. These events are largely exercises in liberationist propaganda, however much they may be advertised by university officials as efforts to discourage sexual harassment, racism, sexually transmitted diseases, bullying, and so forth. Most are utterly one-sided. Dissenting views are never aired, never allowed to be heard. The point seems to be to send the clearest possible message to the new students who may dissent from the prevailing liberationist and identitarian orthodoxy that they are outsiders who had better conform or keep their mouths shut. Now, of course, what goes on in these collegiate re-education camps masquerading as freshman orientation programs and in far too many classrooms is radically different from the classical understanding of what liberal arts education is supposed to accomplish. Formally, the classical and revisionist conceptions are similar. Both propose liberal arts as liberating. Both promise to enable the learner to achieve a greater measure of personal authenticity. But in substance, they could not be farther apart. They are polar opposites. The classical understanding of the goal of liberal arts learning is not to liberate us to act on our desires, whatever they may be, but rather and precisely to liberate us from slavery to them. Personal authenticity under the traditional account consists in self-mastery, in placing reason in control of desire, You'll recall from Plato's dialogues the emphasis on making sure that the soul is rightly ordered, that the appetitive is not in control of the rational, instrumentalizing it to find the way to get what we want, whatever we happen to want, but rather the rational is in control of the appetitive. According to the classic liberal arts ideal, learning promises liberation, but it is not liberation from demanding moral ideals and social norms. It is rather liberation from slavery to self. Now, how can it be liberating to enter into the great conversation with, say, Plato and his interlocutors? What frees us? What is freeing in thinking along with Augustine and Dante or Aquinas and Austin? Beyond being entertained by Shakespeare's charm and wit and astonishing intellectual deftness, why should we make the effort to understand and appreciate his works? According to the classic liberal arts ideal, our critical engagement with great thinkers enriches our understanding and enables us to grasp more fully great truths. Truths that when we appropriate them, please remember that word I just used, appropriate. When we appropriate them and integrate them into our lives as virtues, liberate us from what is merely vulgar, coarse, base. These are soul-shaping, humanizing truths. Truths whose appreciation and secure possession elevates reason above passion or appetite, enabling us to direct our desires and our wills to what is truly good, truly beautiful, truly worthy of human beings as possessors of a profound and inherent dignity. The classic liberal arts proposition is that intellectual knowledge has a role to play in making self-mastery, self-transcendence possible. It can help us to understand what is good and to love the good above whatever it is we happen to desire. And it can teach us to desire what is good because it is good, thus making us truly masters of ourselves. Now, these contrasting views of what liberal learning is supposed to liberate us from reflect competing understandings of what human beings fundamentally are and what it is possible for us human beings to become. They reflect different philosophical anthropologies, if I can use that phrase. I've spoken of the soul-shaping power of truths, but on the revisionist view, there neither is nor can be any such thing as a rational soul to be shaped. There is merely a self. And the self is constituted not by powers of rationality that enable us to know what is humanly good and morally right and direct our desires toward it, but rather our desires themselves, by our desires themselves. Reason's role in our conduct can be nothing more than instrumental. It is not and cannot be the master of desire, but only its servant. Reason cannot tell us what to want, but only how to obtain whatever it is we happen to want. As the 18th century British philosopher David Hume articulated the claim, just quote him here, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions, and may pretend to no office other than to serve and obey them. Sometimes it's suggested that it was the convention-flouting, colorful figure of Jean-Jacques Rousseau who above all others inspired the trend of belief that reached its full flower in the 1960s. I wonder, though, whether the greater blame, or credit, if you agree with it, should fall upon the staid, old, conservative David Hume. In any event, if the Humean understanding is the correct one, if all reason can be is the slave of the passions, then the rational soul is indeed an illusion, and belief in it and in truths that can liberate us from slavery to our desires is something not unlike a superstition. Although Hume himself didn't draw the conclusion, human fulfillment such as it is would seem to consist not then in self-mastery, not in overcoming desires that run contrary to what reason identifies as good and right, but rather in freeing ourselves from the allegedly irrational inhibitions, those hang-ups, that impede us from doing what we want and thus being true to ourselves. Hence the imbecilic slogan that will ever stand as a sort of verbal monument to my generation, the me generation, as we used to call ourselves. Do you remember that slogan? Some of you of a certain age will remember it. What was the me generation slogan? If it feels good, do it. The true liberal arts ideal rejects the reduction of reason to the status of passion or desire's ingenious servant. It is an ideal rooted in the conviction that there are human goods, aspects of human well-being and fulfillment, and a common good in the light of which we have reasons to constrain, to limit, to regulate, even alter our desires. It proposes the study of great works of the humanities and social sciences, with a view to grasping more fully these goods and the reasons they provide, and to understanding them integrally, in their wholeness. What liberal arts learning offers us is truly an audacious hope. You talk about the audacity of hope, here's an audacious hope. The hope of self-mastery, that we really can be masters of ourselves, not pushed around all the time by our feelings and desires, our emotions, our wants. Me, 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 me. Now, can it really be true? That's the question. Can it really be true? What could there be in us or about us that could actually make it possible for human beings to be masters of their desires, feelings, emotions, passions, and not mere slaves to them? Is it really true that we're something above the brute animals? The lion doesn't reflect, ponder, think about whether to take down the gazelle for dinner, whether that's a good thing or not. The lion is motivated by impulse, instinct. It's gonna do it. Self-mastery is not an option. There's no reflection, deliberation, judgment, consideration of what is good and true and right. So what is there about us, if anything, that does make us something other than brute animals? We are animals, we are organisms. Are we truly rational? Not in a Humean, merely instrumental sense, but in a way that would enable us to be masters of our feelings, desires, passions. Something the lion can't do. Well, only this mysterious thing that Plato's Socrates was so centrally concerned about, and that so many great thinkers and writers of the Western intellectual tradition from Plato on have sought to understand and teach us about, namely the soul. Soulless selves could have desires and even a certain form of purely instrumental rationality directed toward achieving the efficient satisfaction of desires, those cost-benefit analysis you're talking about, Pete. But soulless selves could never be masters of their desires, any more than lions or cats or skunks or other brute animals could be. Only by virtue of our rational souls, if we in fact are rational souls, can we exercise the more than merely instrumental forms of rationality that enable us, unlike the brute animals, to be masters of our desires and not mere slaves to self. Now, of course, if you believe in such things as reasons, the consideration of which has the power to constrain desire, reasons that we have access to by virtue of intellectual capacities, capacities that are part of an apparatus that is no mere slave of desire, but can transcend and master desire. If you believe in those things, then what you are looking for, what you are trying to understand and know, are virtues. You are seeking answers to the question, what qualities, what habits of mind, what traits of character make for an honorable, worthy, upright life? What are the habits and minds and traits of character that we should cultivate in ourselves and encourage in our children and our students so as to be masters of our passions rather than slaves? Some years ago, the documentary filmmaker Michael Pack and the historian biographer Rick Brookhiser visited us at Princeton to offer an advanced viewing of their new film documentary biography, George Washington. Some of you may have seen it. It aired on PBS a couple of times. Michael and Rick were there to give us a preview of it. It hadn't aired at that point. Now, some of the students were a bit perplexed when the historian Rick Brookhiser explained to them that Washington came to be who he was by imagining an ideal, truly noble individual, and then trying to be like that person. As a young man, the future statesman formed a picture of the kind of person he would like to be, and then tried to become that person by acting the way he supposed that person would act. He stepped into the role, as Brookhiser said, the role he had designed for himself. He sought to make himself virtuous by ridding himself of wayward desires or passions that would have no place in the character and life of the noble individual he sought to emulate, and by emulating, to become. Now, for someone who understands and believes in the classical liberal arts idea and its ideal of self-mastery, there's absolutely nothing inauthentic at all about Washington's imagining what a virtuous person would be like and then trying to become such a person by living out the virtues that person would embody. On the contrary, this is an act of the most profound authenticity. Washington was legendary among his peers for his self-control, for his self-mastery, including the control of his truly world-class temper. He rarely lost it, but on the few occasions when he did, his friends and associates got a picture of how much self-control it took to hold that hurricane, tsunami back. Washington sought to be master of himself rather than slaves to his desires. But to some of our students that day, Washington's conduct seemed radically inauthentic. In the discussion with Rick Brookhiser, they protested that Washington was merely play acting. He wasn't being his real self, his true self. He was trying to live a life that wasn't his own because he wasn't affirming and following his feelings and desires and passions. Rather, he was trying to reshape his feelings and desires and passions in line with standards drawn from, as one of them put it, outside himself. Now, not all the students saw things in this way, but we can, I think, explain why some of them did. They had drunk deeply of the Kool-Aid of the revisionist conception of what a liberal arts education is all about. A conception rooted in the notion of what a person is, namely a soulless self governed by desires whose liberation consists in freeing himself or being freed from constraints on those desires, be they formal or informal, external or internal. They had not so much as considered the alternative view of the human person that is at the core of the classical conception of liberal arts learning, namely the human being as a rational creature, a creature capable of understanding reasons, in light of which he can become the practitioner of virtues that enable him to discipline his desires and become truly master of himself. Now, why had they not considered that possibility, even to reject it? Why had they not even thought of it? Because, I suspect, it had never been presented to them as an option worth considering. They made it to Princeton with their 1570 SATs and valedictorian status and 4.0 average, and split the atom and invented a new charity, and they did all that stuff, but they had never considered this alternative understanding of what it means to be human. Now, the true founder of the liberal arts ideal was Socrates, at least as presented by his disciple Plato. We have different pictures of Socrates, some of them by less admiring figures in antiquity. But the Socrates we have from Plato is the true founder of the liberal arts ideal. And Socrates' method of teaching, as you all will remember, was questioning, going around making a nuisance of himself, pestering people, asking them inconvenient questions. Socrates is the great exemplar of what the late Alan Bloom labeled the interrogatory attitude, an attitude that even defenders of the classical liberal arts ideal sometimes fail to exhibit and inculcate in their students. The liberal arts ideal assumes, to be sure, that there are right answers to great moral and existential questions. It's the friend of moral conviction and the enemy of moral relativism. But liberal arts teaching is not fundamentally, in fact, it's not at all, about telling students what the right answers are, even when we are confident that we have the right answers. Liberal arts learning is not just about receiving and processing information, even if it's great information, such as historical facts about, say, the Western tradition or the American founding, the stuff I teach. Vital though I think that is, and it does keep me employed. It's not just about reading Aristotle or Chaucer or Shakespeare or Tocqueville and knowing what these great writers said, although that's important too. What it is about is engaging them, getting into the dialogue and discussion with them as if they were young men and women engaging and encountering Socrates himself. It's about wrestling with their ideas, good and bad, right and wrong, true and false, and with the questions they wrestled with, which are often perennial questions that are never finally settled. It's about considering their arguments or arguments that can be gleaned from their work. It's about considering the best possible lines of counterargument and examining alternative points of view. And the range of alternatives students should be invited to consider needs to be very wide. Judgments of quality need to be made. Don't assign your students, if you're a teacher, silly stuff, dumb stuff, demagogic stuff. Assign good stuff, make good judgments of quality, but make sure that they are encountering the best, engaging the best that has been said on all sides of important questions. From the people whose views on those issues you are more sympathetic to the views of people who are good thinkers, but come up with what you think are the wrong answers. This is why freedom of thought and discussion are, as John Stuart Mill rightly taught, so critical. Students must not, even at a Christian institution, even at a religious institution, especially not at a religious institution, students should not be simply presented with officially approved views and that's it. No opportunity to consider criticisms. When I'm asked by, as I occasionally am, by academic leaders at religiously affiliated universities, Yeshiva or BYU or Baylor or Notre Dame or Wheaton, I would say the same to Pepperdine, who are some of the great thinkers that our students should be encountering in their courses? I'll say Nietzsche. And sometimes that startles people. Nietzsche, probably the greatest modern atheist, the most powerful advocate of atheism, the most powerful critic of the Bible, of Christianity, of Judaism. Yeah, smart dude. I want students to feel the force of what he has to say, consider what he has to say. You know why? Because that's how they learn. That's how they learn stuff. I want my own students to consider seriously a range of possibilities, including some, Marxism, for example, that I think are not only unsound, but reprehensible, and whose record in human affairs is a record, as Marxism's record is, of death and abomination. The communists piled up the corpses even higher than the Nazis. I certainly want them to hear the profound arguments advanced against Marxism by people like Hayek and Solzhenitsyn and John Paul II, But I also want them to understand how it was that Marxism could have attracted, and still in some cases attracts, the allegiance of intelligent, morally serious people. The late great historian Eugene Genovese, for most of his productive life as an historian, was a hardcore Marxist. No one has surpassed Genovese's contributions to understanding the history of slavery. His book, Roll, Jordan, Roll, stands today, in my view, as the greatest work in that particular field. I want them to know the arguments Marx and his most brilliant disciples, people like Antonio Gramsci, Theodor Adorno, Herbert Marcuse, made. You find all of them on my reading lists, by the way, if you look at my syllabi. So if professors get canceled for teaching Marxism, I get canceled. In fact, I want them to consider these arguments fairly on the merits. The task of the liberal arts teacher, as I envisage it, is not to tell students what to think. It is to encourage them and teach them how to think more deeply, more critically, and for themselves, to be independent thinkers. It's not just that they have the right answers in their head so they can check the box on the SAT score. Now, why? It's because I think is it because I think there's something intrinsically valuable about the interrogatory attitude? Alan Bloom himself might, I've not made up my mind about this, might have thought so. If you go back and read, now what, gosh, getting on for 35 years later, if you go back and read Closing the American Mind, as I did a couple of years ago, at least I couldn't resolve this question. Does he think that the interrogatory attitude is itself the end? Is it the intrinsic value? The possibility that he did believe that is what opened him up in his own time to the charge of relativism and even nihilism advanced by some culturally conservative critics of Bloom's Closing of the American Mind. The great novelist Walker Percy, for example, faulted Bloom in his review in the New York Times for allegedly holding the view that the point of an open mind is merely to have an open mind rather than to arrive at truths that are to be affirmed and acted upon. So, whether or not the charge is just, and as I say, I still haven't made up my own mind, the charge, if true, if Percy's right in making that allegation, I think it is a damning allegation. The idea of a mind that never closes on a truth is antithetical to the liberal arts ideal. Now, so is dogmatism, the idea that if you're so closed on what you believe the truth is that you won't accept a challenge. You won't consider the possibility that you might be wrong. You fall into the self-idolatry of imagining you're infallible. That's also bad. But avoiding that condition doesn't justify supposing that we should never close our minds in the sense of make a judgment, however tentative, however open to criticism, willing to engage a challenge, a judgment that this is true and therefore this is what I should do. The point of the interrogatory attitude, I believe, is precisely to move from ignorance to truths that can be affirmed and acted on. That's their cash value. So now I want to turn to the real heart of our conference. Academic freedom, including freedom of speech and intellectual discourse, freedom of inquiry, freedom of thought, freedom of discussion. We begin to understand the much misunderstood and abused concept of academic freedom when we consider the central importance of the interrogative attitude to the enterprise of liberal arts learning. The interrogative attitude will flourish only under conditions of freedom, hence the theme of this conference. It can be smothered by speech codes and that sort of thing, to be sure, but it can be suffocated in less obvious ways as well. It can be smothered when well-qualified scholars, teachers, and academic administrators are denied or removed from positions in institutions that claim to be nonpartisan and non-sectarian, or when they are denied tenure or promotion or are subjected to discriminatory treatment. It can be smothered also, though, by an atmosphere of dogma, political correctness, wokeness, what have you, and whether it's of the right or the left or something else. Now, perhaps it's worth pausing here to consider why we care ask why we should care so much about academic freedom, intellectual freedom in the academy. Why ought we to be concerned about, say, the rights of a university staff member who's suspended for stating her Christian views about marriage and sexual morality? That's actually happened. Or a Jewish student who was vilified for his support of Israel in opposition to the BDS movement. It happened a lot. Or an assistant professor who's denied promotion because he dissents from the party line at an allegedly non-sectarian university. Why should we care as much as most of us do, and all of us should, about students who are punished with a bad grade for having the temerity to state views that are out of line with those of the course instructor? What is it about intellectual or academic freedom that makes it worth worrying about and worth fighting for? Now, in my view, Pete, it's not, or not merely, a passion for freedom for its own sake. So I reject the view that freedom itself is an intrinsic value, the end to which all other things are means. We want our young people and those responsible for teaching them to be free from repression or invidious discrimination, but we should fight for these freedoms for a reason that goes significantly beyond them. We should fight for freedom from oppression because we believe that academic freedom is freedom for something. It's not just freedom from the repression. It's freedom for something, something profoundly important, namely the intellectual excellence that makes self-mastery possible, that makes for good people and good citizens. We should struggle to restore and maintain intellectual freedom, including on our college campuses, so that students and scholars can pursue understanding, knowledge, truth more robustly across the arts and sciences and appropriate, there's that word again, and appropriate the great goods of human intellectual striving more fully into their lives for their benefit and the benefit of the common good. We should honor academic freedom as a great and indispensable value because it serves the values of understanding, knowledge, and truth that are greater still. Although some have depicted freedom and truth as antithetical, you've all heard that way of looking at things, that freedom is the enemy of truth, truth is the enemy of freedom. You pays your money and you takes your choice. You can either be for freedom or truth. If you're for truth, that makes you an enemy of freedom. If you're from freedom, oh, you're an enemy of truth. But that's all wrong. In reality, freedom and truth are mutually supportive and indeed dependent on each other. If people have a right to certain freedoms, civil liberties, it's because that is the truth of the matter. They have a right to those. And the worst possible defense, I mean, the most hopeless defense of basic civil liberties generally, whether in the academic and intellectual context or otherwise, the worst possible one is the one you run into in cocktail parties and still in freshman classes from time to time, where people say, well, I think anyone should be able to do whatever they want so long as they don't harm another person, because after all, there's no such thing as truth. All we have is just our own opinions. I mean, philosophy professors like me, we have a lot of fun, with kids who come in and say that, because within 2 minutes we've got them all tied up in knots. They're contradicting themselves. They're presupposing the truth of what they're actually denying, and so forth. It's a lot of fun for us. It's a terrible argument. The defense of academic freedom and the interrogative attitude it serves and supports must implicitly at least, and I think it should be done more often explicitly, appeal to the concept of truth. And any plausible and complete case for academic freedom will present understanding, knowledge, and truth as the intrinsic values and virtues that ground the intelligibility of freedom as something indispensable to their pursuit and meaningful appropriation. On the other side of the question, the overwhelming evidence of history, not to mention the plain evidence under our noses when we examine contemporary academic life, shows that freedom is as necessary to intellectual life as oxygen is to bodily life. Now, should academic freedom be boundless? Obviously not. And the legitimate scope of expression is obviously somewhat narrower in institutions that are founded on stated religious and moral principles than it is at institutions that proclaim themselves to be non-sectarian and nonpartisan. But the scope of freedom as a value that is ordered to truth must be generous, especially in the academy, including in religiously affiliated institutions, where free inquiry, exploration, and experimentation are often essential to insight and richer understanding. Now, of course, even within the legitimate bounds of academic freedom can be abused. Of course, academic freedom does not guarantee excellence or even passable scholarship and teaching. People can use their academic freedom to say dumb stuff, write poor quality research, advocate silly ideas. Sometimes respect for academic freedom insulates abuses. But again, the lessons of history and our current situation are clear. Repression of academic freedom, far from shielding us from error, undermines the very enterprise of truth-seeking. But someone might say, look, there are many truths that we know. Why must we permit them to be denied or questioned, since we know they're true? Why not take the view that error has no rights, or at least clear error has no rights? That was the slogan of the small number of bishops who were holding out against the reforms of the Second Vatican Council in the Catholic Church. They said, but we can't have the kind of freedom that the churches that you're proposing to embrace because error has no rights. Now I hear the same line or a version of it from very secular, very progressive people who believe that when it comes to issues of race, sex, gender, and so forth, error has no rights. Otherwise, those, whether they're of the right or left, who claim that error has no rights, they say, otherwise, doesn't the defense of academic freedom collapse into the self-stultifying denial of the possibility of truth? Doesn't it make freedom rather than truth the ultimate academic value, which I said a moment ago it's not? Well, I've already mentioned that some partisans of academic freedom misguidedly depict truth as an enemy of freedom. They appeal to or presuppose a species of relativism or subjectivism or skepticism in defending freedom of inquiry. It's that bad argument. Now, it's certainly true that one reason for respecting academic freedom is that people can be mistaken. All of us can be, all of us are, all of us right at this moment have certain false beliefs in our head. So if anybody out there, if any of you don't have any false beliefs in your head, where's your hand? You have no false beliefs in your head. No, we're not infallible, right? We're fallible. We know we make mistakes. The question is, how do we move from error to truth, from mistake to fact? How do we get it right? How do we swap out the false beliefs and replace them with true beliefs? We know some of our beliefs are false. We just don't know which ones they are. Well, let me tell you how you're not going to figure out which ones they are. You're not going to figure out which ones are the false ones so you can swap in true ones if you do not allow yourself to be challenged. If you shut down or use the power of your institution or the power of government to shut down anybody who's going to question you, if you immunize yourself, your views from critique, you're going to be stuck forever with those false beliefs in your head with no chance of dislodging them. Yes, that's true, you'll be reinforced in what you believe that happens to be true, but you're also going to be reinforced in what you believe that happens to be false. You're just constantly going to be reinforced and told, you're right, kid, you're right, kid, you're right, kid, you're right, kid. That should not be what happens anywhere, and certainly not in universities of any description. Indeed, for all of us, as frail, fallible, fallen human beings, even unanimity of belief, even if everybody in the room believes the same thing, as we do on some issues, that doesn't guarantee correctness. There have been societies that were united in a certain belief that we would now say was not only a false, but a terrible belief. But everybody believed it. Whether it's a moral belief, a scientific belief, a cultural belief, what have you. But even here, I think that the possibility of error, while it's an important consideration, it's not the primary or even the most powerful reason for honoring academic freedom and protecting it, even in areas where we are confident, secure in our knowledge of the truth. the stronger and deeper reason is that freedom is the condition of our appropriation or fuller appropriation of truth. And here's why, when I first mentioned that word, I signaled that it was going to be important. I use the term because knowledge and truth have their value for human beings precisely as fulfillments of capacities for understanding and judgment. The liberal arts are liberating of the human spirit because knowledge of truth attained by the exercise of our rational faculties is intrinsically and not merely instrumentally valuable. Useful knowledge is, of course, all to the good, and it's wonderful when human beings can serve other human goods, such as health, as in the biomedical sciences, or economic efficiency and growth, or good public policy, or the constructing of great buildings and bridges, or any of a million other purposes. Our knowledge can have wonderful instrumental value. But even useful knowledge is often of more than merely instrumental value. And a great deal of knowledge that wouldn't qualify as especially useful. Getting into the conversation with Plato, Augustine, Austin, the writers of the Federalist Papers. A great deal of what wouldn't be regarded necessarily as useful knowledge is nevertheless intrinsically and profoundly enriching and liberating. This is why we should honor, and honor even more highly than we do in our institutions of higher learning, excellence in the humanities and pure science, social and natural. Knowledge that elevates and enriches, knowledge that liberates the human spirit, cannot be merely notional. It must be appropriated, taken inside, made part of our lives. After all, it's one thing, and it's a good thing, and if it was the best we could get, it would be still worth getting to know that something is the case, so that we can check the right box on the multiple choice test, like an SAT. But it's something else, and something better, and something much more profound, to understand not only what is the case, check the right box, but understand why it's the case, or how it's the case, or what its relationship is to other things that are the case, or to other questions that we haven't yet been able to resolve, or even to understand the deeper, larger, perhaps even existential significance of this or that being the case. So knowledge, as I am conceiving it here, the knowledge that we seek in liberal arts education, is not and cannot be merely a matter of affirming or believing correct propositions. It's got to be appropriated. The knowledge that elevates and liberates is knowledge not only that something is the case, but how and why, what the larger significance is. And typically such knowledge does more than merely settle something in one's mind. Those of you who are scholars, or just anybody who's thought about stuff, knows that sometimes when you learn X, when you gain some knowledge, when you move from ignorance to understanding in one area, what does it do? It opens up a whole new line of questions that you wouldn't ever have imagined had you not gotten hold of this insight. Whole new lines of inquiry. To return then to the question, why respect freedom even where truth is securely known? It's because freedom to inquire, freedom to assent or withhold assent as one's best judgment, one's conscience dictates, is a condition of the personal appropriation of truth by the human subject. The human person, for the sake of whom, or for the flourishing of whom, for the liberation of whom, knowledge of truth is intrinsically valuable. And it is intrinsically valuable not in some free-floating or abstract sense, but precisely as an aspect of the integral well-being and fulfillment of human beings. Rational creatures, rational animals, whose flourishing consists in part in intellectual inquiry, understanding, and judgment, and in the practice of the virtues which make possible excellence in intellectual questioning. The freedom then we must defend is freedom for the practice of these intellectual and moral virtues. It is freedom for excellence, the freedom that enables us to master ourselves, to understand and live by the truth, whether we happen to like the truth as it is or not. It's a freedom that, far from being negated by rigorous standards of scholarship, demands them. It's not the freedom of, if it feels good, do it. It's rather the freedom of self-transcendence, the freedom from slavery to self. Thank you.
Check 1, 2. Okay. We have just a few minutes for questions before we adjourn and move over into the Wilburn Auditorium. We are going to break with a precedent that we will be practicing when we head over there to use the question cards. And so for this session, if you'll just raise your hand, we've got time for just a couple of questions of Dr. George. Any questions? Yes.
The more evangelical Christian tradition has tended to put revelation over reason. I don't notice. Then I think in some of the Pentecostal streams they put reason below the desire.
Well, it's certainly a classic question debated among Christians in different traditions of Christianity about the relationship of reason and revelation, or faith and reason. Some traditions within Christianity, especially on the Protestant side, although not all Protestant traditions are fideistic, but some traditions are fideistic. They believe that, especially when it comes to moral knowledge, really all we can know is what is revealed by Scripture. And I think that probably has something to do with the sense in those traditions of the completion or wholeness or devastatingness of the fall, that it utterly destroys the capacity of reason to attain truth. It corrupts us so thoroughly. It corrupts reason as well as will. It's the utter depravity view. I don't know if this quotation is actually true, and I've been reluctant to look it up. I'm violating my own principle here that you should seek the truth even if you risk finding out that what is true is not something you would like to be true. So I've not looked up something that my old professor, Linwood Irvin from college, who taught me philosophy, attributed to Calvin, a quotation he attributed to Calvin. And I do want it to be true that Calvin said it. He quoted Calvin as saying that the fall was so complete, so devastating, human beings are so corrupted, that on the day of judgment, even the elect will be obnoxious in the sight of God. So that's one view. And if that's your view, then you're not going to rely on reason for much of anything. Now, on the Catholic side, and for some of the Protestant traditions, this is also a debate within Judaism. I heard a couple of really important Jewish authorities debating this out a few years ago. Also within Judaism, there is a debate between fideists and non-fideists. People who think basically you've got what the law and the Scripture says, and that's it. And others who believe that there's a role for reason and therefore philosophy. My own view, and probably not surprising since I'm Catholic, my own view is that John Paul II gets it right and captures it perfectly in the image with which he opens his great encyclical on faith and reason, entitled Fides et Ratio, just the Latin for faith and reason. He says that faith and reason are like the two wings on which the human spirit ascends to contemplation of the truth. They're both necessary. They're both supportive of each other. I was born and brought up in the hills of West Virginia, so it was my growing up life was a Huck Finn boyhood of hunting and fishing and playing bluegrass banjo that I still do, and things like that. And so if you grew up where I grew up, you've seen a few winged birds where you hit the bird in a wing, you didn't kill the bird's on the ground, and the bird is desperately trying to fly to get away. And it can only flap the one wing, though, because the wing's wounded, and so it doesn't get up off the ground, it just goes in a circle, like this with the wing. And I think that's what happens when we pit faith and reason against itself and think we can only rely on one and we have to reject the other. We got the one wing and we're going to go around in circles. We're not actually going to get up off the ground.
Yes, last question.
I thought it was beautiful that you used the word soul. And when I heard it, I thought, oh my goodness, he could say that word. Because we've come so far away from accepting the existence of the soul. What's it like for you at Princeton speaking like this?
It's not a problem. They're much more afraid of me than I am of them. I've spent 36 years at Princeton. I've had a blessed career there. The university has given me every recognition, showered every honor that it can on me. I keep speaking, and you've probably heard things I've said on the most controversial issues, but to its very great credit, I've been allowed to, more than allowed to, encouraged to flourish at Princeton, despite my dissent on things like talking about the soul and moral issues and things like that. Is it perfect? No, we've got a big issue now at Princeton, the case of Professor Joshua Katz that you might know about, that's testing, I think, our university's integrity on some of those questions. That's a very complicated case, more complicated than people know about. But we have had other issues of academic freedom, but I am not a victim. Now, are there conservatives who have been victimized at Princeton and elsewhere for their beliefs? Absolutely. I can tell you cases, I can cite you chapter and verse, but I am not one of them. I have nothing to complain about. If you're interested in the question of the soul, there's a really interesting question about what the soul is. Is it a ghost in a machine? Should we embrace some sort of Cartesian view where we've got a spiritual soul and a separate material body? The material body is the machine, the spiritual soul is the ghost. That's one view. That was actually Plato's view, was something like that. The body is a kind of prison for this non-bodily thing, the soul, yeah. But of course, the mainstream of Christianity and the winning side in Judaism and the great debates on this question have had a different view, one that sees a closer unity of body and soul. Philosophers refer to that, recalling it was Aristotle's position and using the term that he used for it, the hylomorphic view of the soul, where the soul is understood as a substantial form of the body. In an essay of mine that you can find online, which appeared in First Things magazine in 2016, entitled Gnostic Liberalism, Gnostic, G-N-O-S-T-I-C, recalling the ancient Gnostic ideas or Gnostic heresy. In that piece, I talk about the way in which different views, especially the two leading ones, the ghost in the machine view and the hylomorphic view, underwrite different beliefs about the most controversial moral questions of our day: abortion, marriage and sexuality, euthanasia, all that kind of stuff. I think it's a fascinating question. So for me, the real question is not whether human beings have souls. I encounter people thinking all the time they must have rational souls. But what exactly is the soul, and who is right in that great debate? That, to me, is the interesting question.
Please join me again in thanking Dr. George. Well, Robby, you have set a firm foundation for the rest of the afternoon's discussions. The subtitle for this conference, as you've seen on your brochures, are Challenges and Opportunities Through Institutions. And so we begin now the panel portion of the conference, which will begin in the Wilburn Auditorium. And if you'd like to meet the person for whom the Wilburn Auditorium is named, he is right over there, Dean Jim Wilburn. Please say hi. And our founding dean of the policy school. And then, so we are going to begin in about 15 minutes. Just follow this pathway just around and back inside into the auditorium. We'll begin with the first institution we'll be examining is the journalistic media. We will then get on to what is known variously as big tech and the internet, move on to academia, and close with a conversation. And then after that, a reception. So Dr. George, again, thank you so much for setting the foundation for this. And please stay with us for some great panel conversations ahead. Thanks so much.